Okay, well, it was a pleasure to see Mark here, and I saw him last night. He didn't tell you something that you really should bear in mind. I actually helped him get his company Thought sold, and he did something that all of you, when you go public, should do for your lawyers. He invited me out to the launch when he went into space, and got me a little bit of cosmonaut training, including the vomit comet, where you are weightless for about 45 seconds at a time and then very heavy for another 45 seconds. And if you go to my LinkedIn page, you'll see a picture of me in space because of that. It was only today that I realized his diabolical plan, which was to be able to say, how can you trust such a lightweight lawyer? So let me ask the assembled audience, how many people are iPhone users? Okay. And how many of you trust iPhone security? Okay. And how many of you trust US government security decisions about the iPhone? Chinese government? Does anybody want to? Okay, so a substantial but by no means overwhelming decision to trust Apple's security, but no one trusts the US government or Chinese government security decisions. That's what I want to talk about because I think that this is the famous Apple reality distortion field at work again, only quite deliberately deployed. What's always deliberately deployed. Because the story that everyone has in mind here is that Apple is standing up and fighting for privacy. They're fighting against the government of the United States, trying to do what Tom was talking about earlier, force access technology into all of the tools that we use, and that Apple is fighting that because it is a security risk. If it does this for the US government, it will create a tool that will inevitably spread and be used by criminals and then by repressive regimes. That's the story. We've all heard it. And I just want to point out two serious problems with that story. First, maybe three. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's a lawyer's problem. Apple is not being subjected to some new regulatory regime. This is a statute that has existed for as long as there has been a Fourth Amendment in the United States, 225 plus years. And it says, in essence, as interpreted by the courts, if you can help the government after it's gotten an access order, you're uniquely in a position to help the government, and it's not too much of a burden, then you have to help the government get access to whatever facility might be in question. So this might turn out to be an order that will be obtained to serve on the landlord of an apartment where a criminal or a terrorist is present. If the landlord has an extra key to that apartment, then rather than break down the door, the government could serve an order like this on the landlord, and the landlord would have very few defenses if they actually have the key. So that's the legal context in which this comes up. This is not a request that Apple redesign its products so that they will always be friendly to law enforcement. Instead, what the government has said is, we think Apple can get us into, or get us closer to getting into this phone. And Apple has admitted that's true. Yes, it will take them some time. It will take 2 to 4 weeks with 6 to 10 employees, not even all of them engineers, as far as I can tell. And then they'll have a product that will wipe out one security feature, which is the 10 strikes and we erase all your data provision. So they can do this, and there will be an argument about whether that's too much work for them to have to do that is interesting but rather limited. I think the fact that they can do this and the way they're going to do this tells us something really critical about the case, something that the distortion field refuses to recognize. The way they're going to do this is they're going to write a new special operating system, or at least a feature of the operating system, that takes out that 10 strikes and you're out rule. And they're going to serve it up to the phone of one person, the dead terrorist in the San Bernardino case, his phone, and sign it with a digital signature that only Apple has, their private key, that says, go ahead and accept this update from Apple. And the phone is going to say, yes, I'm programmed to accept and trust code I get from Apple if it's signed with this signature. That's really critical for the question of what's at stake here. Because when Apple says, oh, building in this feature means the feature will inevitably escape and be used by criminals or by repressive regimes, they must be saying one of two things. They're suggesting that they're going to write code that gets rid of the security feature, and the security feature will be wiped out by this code spreading. But the code can't spread. The code has to be delivered to a particular phone, and it has to be signed by Apple with this secret signature. And that means that Apple will continue to control who gets this security-reducing feature and in what circumstances. This is not going to be out of control once it is built, because, frankly, you could deploy the code that gets rid of that security feature, and it wouldn't do criminals any good. You could publish it in the newspaper. It wouldn't do criminals any good, because they don't have the ability to update the iOS the way Apple does. Now, it's true, Apple also could lose control of their digital signing code, their private key. But if that happens, the least of all our problems is that this one security feature might be weakened by using code that was written for the FBI, because that would mean that anybody who has that code could send arbitrary code of any kind to update the iOS and gain access to it. So at the end of the day, what they're doing for the FBI is irrelevant to the question of how much this security feature will spread on its own. Now, they make another argument, which is a slightly more sophisticated argument, which is, Apple controls it, but once they do this for the FBI, other repressive regimes will insist that it be done for them. And there's two problems with that. The protestation of purity and a reluctance on the part of Apple to ever be involved in enabling government access. The first is that repressive regimes do not need the permission of the Central District of California magistrate to demand that Apple do for them what those repressive regimes want. Once Apple has said, yes, we can do it, well, the repressive regimes just show up and say, we're not interested in getting rid of a simple 10-strike rule. We just want access to the phone, and you've admitted that you can update the phone. So just update it with an iOS that gives us full access anytime we want without a court order. What happens in California in this case is irrelevant to the motivations of the Chinese government or the French government or the Russian government. They can do it if they can get Apple to agree to deploy its secret key to vouch for a particular update. And that takes us to the last question, which is, but Apple doesn't want to be in a position of helping repressive regimes. And so they're still standing for purity and innocence in the world of technology. And I have been quoted on this. It's a story that no one in this audience will fully appreciate, but there was an actress once named Doris Day who was famous for appearing in 1950s movies as the epitome of the girl next door, virginal, innocent, and wholesome. And Oscar Levant once said about her, you know, I'm so old, I remember Doris Day before she was a virgin. You know, the fact is, we all remember Apple and Tim Cook before he was a virgin. When repressive regimes have come knocking, Apple has not said what they have said in the United States. We're going to alert all our customers. We're going to fight in on the beaches and in the hills to stop this. They have done things that look suspiciously like quietly surrendering to repressive regimes and letting those regimes make security decisions about the iPhone. They moved the iCloud storage for Chinese iPhone users, and for all we know, our iPhones, to China, where it is clearly subject only to Chinese law and all of the civil liberties protections that go with it. They didn't make an announcement of it. They certainly didn't fight it. They didn't even tell us they were doing that. They just, it leaked and they acknowledged it. And then they said, oh, but don't worry, we encrypted it so that China Telecom can't read it, which was, I'm sure, everybody's biggest worry. And then in the iPhone 4, the Chinese government went to them and said, we have secret encryption algorithms. You can't see them, they are classified. Well, there's one good reason not to let people see your algorithms. It's if they've been backdoored. No one accepts encryption that they cannot read if they want real security. But the Chinese, and when the Chinese government proposed this for standards organizations, the standards organizations rejected these secret algorithms. But the Chinese government wanted them in their version of Wi-Fi, and they said to Apple, you just install them in every Chinese iPhone starting with iPhone 4, because we say so. And Apple did it, again, very quietly, without an explanation, certainly without a bold and brave explanation of their commitment to civil liberties. They just did it. They have justified that in the last 2 weeks since I asked questions about it by saying, yeah, those suspicious algorithms, that's a trade issue, not a security issue. I don't quite understand that unless they meant they traded our security for their income. But they have never given a good explanation of why they think that this is fair. So what that tells us at the end of the day is Apple is not really fighting to make sure that they can't help repressive regimes. They're fighting to try to prevent the FBI from getting access to this phone, even though they've made some very suspicious compromises already with the repressive governments they keep showing us as the reason why they should not help the FBI in a terrorism case. And what that boils down to in the end, I think, for all of you who raised your hand to say, we trust Apple, but we don't trust China and the United States, is you may not know it, but you already trust China and any other government that has sufficient leverage to either bribe or punish Apple until it provides whatever access that government wants. And I note that the French government, by a vote of 474 to 30, I guess, has already said, and if Apple tries that stuff that they're doing with the FBI on us, we're going to charge them $1 million every time they say it. And we'll see. You know, I'm sure that the French government would be glad to make that 10 million or 100 million until they get into a range that Apple recognizes as real money. And at the end of the day, then, while this is a really interesting issue and the question of how to regulate or whether to regulate encryption is a hard issue, I don't think this case raises that issue or is that hard a case. So, Tom?
Thank you, Stewart. Thank you very much. If you want to take a seat over there, I've been asked to come in and ask some more questions. So first of all, can we get a round of applause for that talk, please? That was wonderful. Thank you. It sort of feels like there are two issues being conflated here. That first of all we have thank you. First of all, we have the issue of whether Apple should be required to write code and make that, and then secondly, we have the issue of whether government should have access to data, whether it should be legally possible to write an encrypted messenger or encrypted anything that cannot be unlocked. And you haven't really touched on the second. So we were saying in defense of government access to data, for what I suspect is a crowd on the other side of that generally, what would you say?
So I have to say I didn't touch on it in part because I can't give quite as full-throated a defense of that idea as I can give a full-throated discrediting of Apple's reality distortion field. It's a hard issue. I lived through and represented a bunch of clients in the context of CALIA and in the context of the ETSI standards that called for access to phone systems. It's a very aggressive and detailed set of requirements that governments have imposed through standards or through law. And it had lots of problems that any regulatory program will have. And there have been at least possible compromises, one or two, particularly in Greece, that suggested that the features that were required by governments might have been misused by attackers. So there are certainly risks associated with that. On the other hand, there are grave risks associated with guaranteeing the security of criminals, terrorists, and the like in ways that have never been guaranteed before.
Right, because it is now possible to make a mathematically unbreakable communicator. I mean, it's been done.
Oh, absolutely. It's been done hundreds of times. It turns out not to be as easy as the people who write those codes think. And we are better off living in a world where people like Telegram say, hey, I've got this great solution, and don't maybe know everything they should know about how to build security systems. We'd be better off if it's just app writers who are still doing that in their basement in their spare time, as opposed to companies like Apple and Google bringing to bear all of the expertise that they can possibly purchase on building something that locks out governments. I'm not sure that world is as comfortable as one where lots of mistakes are being made.
I'm sort of reminded of card counters in Vegas casinos. If you count cards, they will welcome you. They will give you free food and drink as long as you're not that good at it.
Yes. Exactly.
Because if you're perfect, you'll knock them out. But if you make one mistake, then you're going to be losing.
And crooks and terrorists are not that good at evaluating the encryption that they're buying. They tend to believe that they can't trust Apple, but that they can trust some guy who wrote Mujahideen secrets.
Right. So is it a case of really the US government seems to be, and the UK government as well, with the bill they're pushing through now, are more worried because technology is reaching the point where actually that is going to be a serious problem?
Yes, for a long time people said, well, show me the problem, but we clearly can see the problem now. There are hundreds of phones that can't be accessed despite having court orders, and ISIS has built its recruitment strategy on attracting people through open communications and then shifting their most vulnerable converts over to something that is encrypted and that governments can't get into.
Yeah, it used to be, I forget who said it, they'll only catch the stupid ones. But that was 99% of the people that the government was interested, perhaps 99.9%, and that's starting to creep lower and lower.
Right. Now the stupid ones can rely on all of Silicon Valley to be on their side.
I mean, you say Silicon Valley, but we have, so Telegram Messenger, although I say security audits may not be perfect on that. But as an example, we have Pavel Durov, who wrote it in Russia, is now living in self-imposed exile in St. Kitts and Nevis. Given it's global...
Tough life, huh?
I know. Given that it is global, given that all it takes is one person in one country, I mean, theoretically, ISIS could write their own messenger. I doubt you'd get it in the App Store, but at the level where anyone can create that.
Yes, and the problem is, as I said, it is very hard when you have 100 secure apps, all of which tell you that they're better than the other 99, to make a decision, and often you make bad decisions. But as big companies make it their job to build security into everything they have, and not just security, but government-proof encryption, even the dumbest crooks and the dumbest terrorists get the benefit of enormous research budgets.
Now, let's not forget that one of the reasons behind this is the NSA's mass surveillance, the leaks that Edward Snowden gave to the world. Given that part of the push towards encryption, particularly we saw from Google yesterday that they are now flagging if the email is not encrypted in transit. Given that the NSA was essentially sucking everything into its database, that's one of the arguments in favor of encryption, is that someone's going to grab everything.
So that is the concern. My concern runs in the other direction, that we have set up as democratic societies mechanisms for deciding where privacy ends and the need to enforce the law begins. It usually starts with making a determination about, do you have a basis for suspecting this person? Do you have a basis for believing that your intrusion into his privacy will produce evidence of a crime? Having an independent judicial determination about that. And once that is done, then privacy interests end and the government's ability to gain access to the data starts.
I feel like most people here are going to be in favor of court orders, proper oversight, everything like that, that if it were possible to have a safe unlock, I think...
So you would think so, but in fact, the decision to deploy encryption everywhere means, as Jim Comey of the FBI will often say, that means that I can get all the court orders in the world. In fact, they have a court order for this phone. And if the encryption is unreadable, essentially that court order is not worth the paper it's printed on. And that means you are saying the corporate interests of the company that created that security and their assessment of the user's need for privacy trumps the laws of the countries that say, no, we have a way of deciding how much privacy criminal suspects get and when the government can get access to it. And Apple and others are essentially saying, yeah, you can take your warrant and stuff it where the moon don't shine.
But that's because it used to be shades of grey. It used to be that wiretapping literally meant you were clamping something onto a wire leading to someone's home, or you were literally following someone around with a camera. It's now at the point where, because both of mass surveillance and warrantless wiretaps, and because of companies going to full encryption, there isn't that shade of grey anymore. It looks like we're headed towards one side or the other.
Yeah, or maybe both at different times.
Yes.
Yeah,
depending on which country they're trying to sell to.
Yes, although I wrote a book called The Limits of Trust, which I do not recommend to anybody here. It was a response to the export control debate. This was the first crypto wars, which I also was a combatant in.
Some of the folks here might actually be too young to remember that. I just remember the photos of people literally printing off source code and flying it on a plane.
Yes, so we
summarize.
The U.S. government had controls on strong encryption being exported. They said you can write any encryption you want inside the United States. Americans deserve the best security that anybody can design, but people outside the United States are potential targets, and we don't want this encryption sold. It was a version of the debate we're having now, except the definition of the limits of privacy were the borders of the United States, or some other countries if there were licenses. I was at NSA when that first became a controversy because Netscape had just come along. There was a GUI for the internet, as I told the director of NSA. Microsoft came to me and said, we need encryption because we're going to be putting it in your toaster because your toaster's going online. So they were certainly looking pretty far forward. We aren't even there yet quite. And that fight between Silicon Valley and Microsoft in its full, oh, did we wreck your business model? Sorry, mode, was proposing to do that to export controls. And in the long run, after a bitter battle, they did win that. I like to say I was in that war, and I feel like a survivor of the Great War when he discovers that his experience has been demoted to World War I. It was a big deal at the time, and now it's just history repeating itself. So that fight, I think, had many of the elements that we have today, other than the fact that, the reason I got into this is I said, you can get rid of U.S. export controls. There are many countries that have import controls. They will not get rid of their import controls. And I wrote a book to show all the import controls around the world. Most of those are still in existence, if you want to know that. So I turned my book into a database, and we sell the access to the database. So come talk to me about that if you're interested. But there are plenty of countries that regulate encryption already, and even more that will regulate with enthusiasm companies like Apple and Google, because they hate them already.
Yeah, so this is, as you say, Apple's stance is kind of hypocritical but pragmatic. They are, would you say they are scared of the Chinese government simply saying no more iPhones?
Oh, it's their biggest market. They sell more iPhones in China than anywhere else. When I think the iPhone 6 was coming out after Snowden, the Chinese government turned it into a patriotic campaign to dislike Apple and showed that they could really hurt Apple. And then suddenly all that went away after some unspecified security issues had been resolved. And we don't know exactly what Apple agreed to do, but you can bet it was what it took to please the Chinese government.
Right. So meanwhile, in the US, they have decided that this is the place to take a stand because presumably they can, in your words, I guess, they can get away with it there?
I think they believe they can. They believe not only that they can get away with it, but that it is, combined with the Apple reality distortion field, they can make it a selling point.
Right.
They can tell people, see, we care about your privacy. The other people, the Android folks, they don't care as much as we do, and you should join with us in this crusade.
Would you say that the warrantless wiretaps, the Snowden leaks, have been a cause of that, or was this always going to be on course? Was it always going to be steadily getting more?
I think it was always going to happen. The tech community, having been primed by the first crypto war, was always suspicious of government controls. I think that Snowden led to a lot of condemnations of U.S. tech companies and suspicions directed at them. Silicon Valley read that objection through their own libertarian lens and said, oh, they hate us because we're not good for privacy, so let's be better for privacy. I tell them that I think the answer is European governments just hate you because you're so big and successful. They will be glad to hate you for being too good on privacy, as the French General Assembly is showing. There is no way to make European governments or the Indian government love big U.S. tech companies. But Silicon Valley, since it fits their view of the world, is inclined to think, well, we can win everybody's love if we just lock the U.S. government out.
So let's drill down a little bit on what the US is asking there. They are asking for Apple to write code, essentially. Mm-hmm. And there's a US First Amendment question there, in a certain extent. The law on whether code is free speech has never actually gone to the Supreme Court, I believe. It's kind of half and half, depending on which precedents you go with.
Yeah.
Would you say it's a First Amendment thing that they are essentially being required to perform an act or to speak by writing that code?
I have said that is the second dumbest argument in Apple's brief, because, there are certainly circumstances. You can write a book. Schneier's cryptography book is full of code that is communicative. It says this is how you do this. This is the way it works. It's easier and faster to express it in code than to talk about it. So there are certainly expressive circumstances for source code to be treated as code, but the government is not asking Apple to express a view here. They're asking Apple to have an effect, to provide code to the phone that will lead the phone to do certain things or not do certain things. And this is all focused on the conduct and the effect as opposed to the speech or the expression that Apple is engaged in. And I think I have suggested that, in 5 years, the police are going to pull up behind you and say, pull to the side of the road, sir. And it surely cannot be a defense to say, oh, I'm sorry, that's going to require code, and it goes against my First Amendment rights to use that code.
So how about the slippery slope argument, that you start with one backdoor? I realize you addressed this a little on stage, but once Apple has written that government OS, is there another lawsuit, another requirement that comes along that says, actually, no, we're going to take that? Actually, no, you're required to do this whenever a police department, and anyone, a legal subpoena arrives?
So I think there is, on this point, I will confess to a certain sympathy for Apple. If they would admit that this was their problem, they would be more realistic. Once they admit that they can do this, they are going to be asked to do it more often. In the United States, they will only be asked to do this if there is a warrant, and the democratic and legal processes have been carried out, but they know that they're going to be asked elsewhere. But their problem is they really just do not want to be in the position of unlocking phones for people. I have suggested that it's, they think that having all these sheriffs hanging around Cupertino is just tacky. They don't make money off this. They might be able to recover their costs, but their real problem is they find themselves over and over again having to make hard decisions, having to spend money on lawyers to decide whether they should unlock a particular phone in response to a particular order. They could end up, if they actually admitted what they were doing, in the same position that Yahoo was when they got a valid Chinese order saying, tell us what the content of this particular, or who the owner of this particular account is. And the Chinese said, Yahoo said, we have to do this. We're operating in China, and this is Chinese law, so we're going to do it. And then they were pilloried and sued, and lots of accusations of being a tool of repressive government. Apple looks at that and says, why do I want that? I don't want to be in the business of deciding whether to give access. But that's a business call. They don't like that business line, and the alternative is to say, we're not going to let even democratic governments that have met the legal standards have access, and there's a big cost to that, too.
I think one of the more paranoid responses there is imagining, I don't know what your political leanings are, but for those of us over here in Europe, let's say that the nightmare scenario of a 2017 President Trump and Vice President Palin administration comes along, and then let's say 2020 you have Ted Cruz and Pat Robertson or something like that. You have this government change. You are not just giving this to who is currently in charge, you're giving it to everyone in the future because you're setting that precedent. Is that a worry, or is that scaremongering?
Of course, living in a democracy under the laws that are passed by that democracy means that for many of us, at least half the time, there are laws that we wouldn't have voted for if we'd had the chance. But the problem with that argument, it seems to me, is it proves too much. If that's the worry, we should take away guns from the army, and certainly nuclear weapons. Those are all things that can be misused in far more dangerous ways than access to encryption.
But those are also things that are on a sliding scale. I'm fairly sure there's not many Second Amendment fans in the US who should say there should be personal nuclear weapons. And equally, there's no one on the other side who thinks that butter knives should be banned. But that's where we have a shade of grey. And again, here in encryption, there isn't an easy way to make sure there is a backdoor.
So it is clear. Everyone says it's math. You can't fight the math. And if you introduce a weakness, it will be a weakness that everyone can exploit. And I certainly recognize that if you introduced an algorithmic weakness, and there have been circumstances, it used to be you could only use 40-bit keys for exported products, and that was always a weakness, and now it's trivial to break it, and so anybody can do it. But that's not necessarily how you would ensure access. If Apple had said, we have a compromise, we're going to make this stuff as secure as possible, but if we are served with a valid warrant, we will do a unique update to the person who owns the phone, to his phone and only his phone, that will take away his security. Until they decided to pick this fight, I think a lot of people would have said, well, that's a plausible compromise. So what you do is you don't try to modify the math, you try to find some other mechanism for providing access. And there's theology around, well, any access is a hole, but it creates a vulnerability, sure. But so does writing 1,000 lines of new code. You write 1,000 lines of new code for your program, you've introduced a vulnerability, you just haven't found it yet. And yet, no one who serves us code for our machines has decided to stop doing updates because they recognize there's a vulnerability, and they're going to manage that vulnerability. They've got a whole host of mechanisms for making it less likely that there will be a compromise, and that's exactly the same thing you would do with a government access capability. You would want to build a lot of protections around that because you felt that government access in the long run was better for society than allowing criminals to be able to keep evidence on their phones and have it be secure from search.
So do you think the US government, if let's say that theoretically a country somewhere else in the world, and I'm going to pick Estonia because we had their chief information officer here yesterday and they're doing e-government and everything like it. They're talking about data havens, they're talking about security. Let's say they decide to say, and I'm not saying Estonia, some country decides to say, actually, we're not going to follow the US on that. We are going to have, we're going to allow Apple to completely encrypt phones here and sell that access onwards. Do you think that's something that's going to cause a problem? I mean, hell, there may be a hosting provider somewhere out in this room who is thinking there is a business opportunity there in...
Yeah, my guess is Iceland. They're going to say not only is the power cheaper, but we're going to defy the rest of the governments of the world. Yes, that is a possibility. But I think, again, it's such an engineer's solution because it ignores the reality of the world we live in. You can store your data in Iceland or Estonia and thumb your nose at the FBI unless the FBI has a law that says you need to provide it, in which case they will sue you and they will say you're selling your product here, you're taking advantage of our laws, and therefore we are going to impose this requirement on you. I loathe the right to be forgotten. It's an insane piece of censorship on the part of the European governments, and it's mostly going to be valuable to French ministers who want their last mistress but one forgotten. Google has bent its knee to that, even to the point of restricting access to information on Google.com, because they can be sued, not because the data is stored in France, but because their sales of advertising makes them vulnerable to a lawsuit. So I'm just not sure that storing the data someplace else is really a solution against a determined government access requirement.
Well, the UK has passed, I think, Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act a few years ago, which was essentially that if you are in control of encryption and you claim to have lost the key, that is in itself a criminal offence. Even if you have, you must be able to decrypt on demand. If the US moves towards that decrypt on demand, presumably you'd guess that most tech companies would want to continue selling to the US?
Yeah, they would have to. I mean, who would want to do business with a company that says, "Yeah, I forgot my private key"? So in the end, they will have to. They won't be able to say they forgot it. Now, whether the U.S. government is going to do that is open to question. I'm not convinced that that's where the U.S. government is going to come out, looking at the politics of this. But they could easily do, you know, I was asked at South by Southwest when I was there a couple of days ago, are there any compromises short of mandating a key? And I said, yeah, sure. For start, thinking of Apple, if somebody says, I'm not going to give the data to the FBI because I stand for freedom and purity and civil liberties. Anybody who says that ought to be required to disclose after a pretty intensive investigation every accommodation that they have made for every other government in the world, so that we actually can evaluate just how committed to civil liberties and purity they are. Another possibility, you know, the companies that are selling security and selling privacy say there's a market demand for it, and we are simply meeting that demand, and it serves many valuable, important functions in society. And those costs that you're suffering, you know, the dead girl with the iPhone that's locked, or the child porn that may be on the phone, that's a shame, but it's worth it. And I think we might say, fine, you can store this information, you can provide security, but maybe you ought to pay the costs of providing that security. Maybe it should be possible to bring a lawsuit against companies that have unbreakable encryption. If someone says, well, I'm the victim of unbreakable encryption, somebody ought to pay. How about the guys who are making so much money from providing that unbreakable security?
So with a couple of minutes left, there are plenty of folks out there who are running cloud storage solutions, selling cloud storage solutions, or in the companies that are kind of one level above and reselling those. What would be your advice to them as we go into the encryption war 2, as it were? What would be your advice to them as how to navigate the minefield that's going to be the next few years?
So I suspect that inevitably there is going to be a reassertion of national law with respect to the activities of cloud providers and others. It's not the internet we were promised in the 90s when, you know, people were declaring internet independence from republics of meat and steel. But it is a fact that governments have enormous authority and are going to utilize that. And that means that data localization in one form or another is inevitable to a significant degree. And we're going to have to accommodate to that in a variety of ways. That may be good for business for some people here, bad for others. But I do believe that data localization in some form or other is part of our future.
Thank you very much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, Stewart Baker is the author of Skating on Stilts and the blog that goes with it, and the podcast. Do you want to tell them about the podcast very quickly? Yeah.
So if you want more of this, which is a big if, I recognize, I do a podcast every week, the Steptoe Cyber Law podcast, where you can learn about cyber law and get a completely alien perspective on those cyber law developments at the very same time. So just look for it. It's on iTunes until Tim Cook figures that out.
Ladies and gentlemen, one last time, big round of applause, please, for Stewart Baker.